You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. And we're now going to be talking to Jim, our first of 3 sound artists for our project Art Transmission, which of course is funded by Ideas Test, Creative People and Places. Basically, it's a project that probably started around about December with Jim, who started with the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway. There's 2 other projects currently running. One is at the local boxing club in Bluetown. The other is at the Sheppey Horticultural Society here on the island. Both of those have got their own separate artists, Jane and Kate. And Jim was our first sound artist who's been working with the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway. A real special evening, as we're going to be playing our first part of Sound Art. We're going to be playing a part each week. Of course, Jim's going to be telling you more about that. But firstly, Jim, it's good to have you back in the studio. And really, I can't believe just how quick it's gone.
It's flown past, Daniel. It's quite unbelievable. But time has its own set of wings, I think, that carry it forward and backward.
Well, I was wondering perhaps if we could start off, Jim, by doing a little bit of an introduction about yourself and about the project as kind of a refresher for our listeners, I think, really.
Yeah, I was contacted by Art Transmission during November when I found out they were looking for some sound artists to come down and work. It was really a sort of 3-way project between myself and BRFM and yourself here, community radio show, and the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway, based over there, which is a heritage railway which runs open to the public, and it runs steam trains up from Sittingbourne into the Kemsley Mill site, which is their headquarters. And they've got a fantastic selection of old steam locomotives and some classic diesel locomotives, and a very large range of wagons, and it's a very interesting site down there. If you've never been down there, well worth a visit. There's timetables online. I'm sure all that information is readily available. Is it, Daniel?
Yes, yeah, you can find it by simply searching Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway, but there's also links on our website, brfm.net as well, so yeah, easily findable.
Yeah, well, what can I say? It's well worth. Please do come and visit. And I guess my input to the project was to come down. I'm a sound artist, and open my ears and my mind, of course, to what takes place down at the railway. And they've been absolutely amazing to me and to yourself, I think, Daniel. They've been so accommodating, so generous. The members have taken us under their wing completely. They've given us great access to the site, and it's quite an amazing site. The railway, if you don't already know, is not probably what you call your usual heritage railway, with journeys through leafy sort of Hampshire countryside. This is a very real working railway that reflects its heritage, related to Sittingbourne and Kemsley history. And this is a history that stretches back, I believe, into the 18th century, where it was a site of paper making. And as the Industrial Revolution took place, the mill became industrialised, steam-powered, and there was obviously a place in there, starting from 1905, for a light railway. And a light railway is like it's a narrow gauge railway, so roughly the trains are probably half the size of mainline trains, and this was, it was fit to purpose. And the trains, I mean, they did everything. They carried pulp from the docks, which is needed to make the paper. They would carry coal, and the finished paper products, they'd carry them back out to the docks so they could be shipped, or up to meet the mainline railway to carry the paper up to London, where the paper was, I think, initially used for a paper called the Daily Chronicle, which eventually went through various, morphed through various incarnations. The Daily Chronicle ended up being absorbed by the Daily Mail in the end. But in its day, it was, in England, there was a different political system, and Daily Chronicle was very much a liberal newspaper, and I think they were very, at that stage in history, they were, there was a lot of philanthropy. And that's also reflected in the local history, where there was a sort of model village built in Kemsley. And something that always intrigued me about this is that the guy Frank Lloyd, who had a lot of input, he'd inherited the mill from his father, decided that when the workers who would live in this model village opened their door, all the doors in all the houses had to face away from the mill. So they wouldn't open the door and sort of go, oh my God, I've got to go to work. They'd look out and they'd have a beautiful view.
Well, it sounds amazing, and you always sound passionate about it. So, Jim, how has it been working with the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway over the last, I suppose, 3.5 months, probably?
3.5 months now. Well, as you said, Daniel, the time has indeed flown. It seems like just yesterday I was sitting here for our very first interview and taking that first memorable steamline ride along the line, sitting in the carriage with being enveloped in these incredibly noisy clacking sounds. Now I suppose coming to the project, like any sort of project, you're asked to come up with some ideas initially, which I did, and it's very good to have that sort of skeleton of an idea you can enter a project with. And you're really playing off two things here. You want to come in with an initial idea for a project, so you've got a strong base, something to work against, but also you don't want to have too many preconceptions. You don't want to come in with too much of a concrete plan, because invariably if you do that, it will kind of rebound. I mean, in fact, as a sort of metaphor, I'd see it, the approach is a bit like hitting a ball into a sort of tennis court, and you're not quite sure who your opponent is. Maybe you're playing in the dark, and the ball might come back and smack you in the head, or it might go flying over your head, or it might come back and you can knock it back there again. So there's this kind of interplay of sort of ideas. And when I sort of entered the project, like I say, I had an idea about doing some dramatic work there, and it's, I think one of the reasons I was asked to come down, because I've got a track record of doing participatory drama with various sort of groups, radio-based work, and I think, dare I say, I've got a kind of expertise in doing that. But as I came into the SKLR project, the first thing that struck me was the sounds themselves are so dramatic. Obviously steam sounds, but there's so many sounds out there. I mean, the mill itself, based, surrounded by the existing, D.S. Smith paper mill, it's a source of incredible sounds, the place itself, and in every sort of sense. And if you open your ears, beyond the really obvious sounds of the trains down there and the rattles of carriages and the diesel sirens and movement over tracks, there's also all the very hard work that goes down there. Now, in wintertime, the SKLR shuts down effectively. When I say shuts down, what I mean is it ceases to run a passenger service, because there's much needed maintenance to be done. I mean, every couple of years they need to get a bill of health on the viaduct. I mean, could you mention about the viaduct, Daniel, just to explain what that is, if people don't know?
Well, it's a concrete viaduct, and it's probably something you might not always be aware of, but it runs along the back of where Asda is and the sort of industrial bit of Sittingbourne there, and you'll have to drive under that viaduct if you go to the Sittingbourne tip, or there's a scrapyard there. So it's sort of it's there, kind of entangled around that sort of area, and I think it's one of the longest viaducts in the country, if not sort of further afield. But it's an amazing structure.
It is. It's quite a beautiful structure, and obviously that carries the train up into Sittingbourne. It used to take the trains up into the mill, and there's a gentle gradient as you come out of Kemsley. It's like the track climbs all the way, and it struck me, having walked up that track and towards the viaduct, what an amazing feat of engineering that was, to be built, at the start of the 20th century. I mean, this is like 100 years ago, well over, out of concrete, which was very unusual for those days. I think most things they were still building out of iron in at that time. So it's one of the very first solid concrete structures, and it's still structurally sound. They have this checked out every year. That's one of the sort of things. Now, wintertime when the mill is shut, there's a huge amount of work that goes on in the mill. So when I say it shuts down, in effect it shuts down for maintenance, and this is when a lot of the real work starts. There is so much to do. There's teams like they have these exotic names, so all the SKLRs divided into these compartments, and for instance one of these compartments is known as Permanent Way. I love that, Permanent Way, what a great saying. And the Permanent Way is another term for a railway. So the Permanent Way gang go out and they have a lot of work to do. When you think about a railway, it's made up, the rails, the metal rails out there, are supported by these wooden slats called sleepers. They take all the weight of the train, so they sit in the ground, and around here it's quite wet, isn't it? I mean, with the swale, I mean, it's quite, we've had all this water this year. It's been very boggy. I've been walking around the fields here, and I always come back with muddy boots, if not muddy knees, or sometimes mud up to the chest if you don't watch where you're going. So amongst all this mud and wet, it gets into these sleepers. They sit in the ground, and eventually, over time, they start to absorb the water, even though they're treated to be waterproof. Over, say, 30 years, I think it's the average. Is it that the average life?
I think it was. They were saying around about that.
30. So these things need replacing, and it's a great big job to go in. So they send the diesel up with a flatbed truck. It's loaded up with ballast and tools, and this is all done by hand, all the kind of, they haven't got power tools. They've got shovels and picks. They have to dig out the old sleepers. These things weigh a lot. Load them up, pour ballast down, arrange the earth, put the new sleepers in under the rail, and then they use these wonderful metal plates that we'll be coming back to later in the series, because Daniel did me a great favour. We hung some up on a structure in the railway, some of these old disused iron fish plates, because they sound very beautiful. They've got a very sonorous quality. When struck, they sound rather like bells. It's kind of, they've got a very... The sound carries a long sort of way. So they get these sleepers, and using these fish plate things, they fasten the rails back to these sleepers. So it's a huge amount of work. And these things regularly need replacing. So the team is out all winter working non-stop. And like I said, this is just one of very many departments down there. There's so many other tasks to go on. There's the sort of CAF that needs renovating. We've had terrible storms and wind. There's been so many roofs and leaks on the sort of sites. I think everyone nationally has suffered from the sort of storms. There's been leaks and tiles flying all over the place. So you can imagine on this site, it's fairly wild down by Milton Creek there. It's fairly open. So when the wind whips in off the creek, it comes straight in off the sea. It's wild. It just rushes in and blows everything about. In fact, what happened to the tree, Daniel? The lovely tree that we loved. Can you talk about the tree?
Yeah, there was a lovely big conifer tree. That,
wasn't it beautiful?
That they had to remove, I think, before the wind did finally bring it down. But,
yeah. I mean, it was. I actually got a recording of it a couple of days before it disappeared. I think I was down there on a Wednesday, and we had a really, really stormy day. And this sound was, I was standing there and I was thinking, because I do a lot of listening, just standing and listening, absorbing, saying, what should I record today? And the sound of the wind through this conifer was it was like a kind of Hollywood sound effect. It was such a loud, whistling, wild, moaning sound. And I got my microphone and I stood there in the sort of wind. I mean, I was being blown from side to side. I mean, I can't tell you how wild it was. The weather was crazy. Only the lunatics, the SKLR people and ourselves were standing out, and everyone else was sheltering, I think, indoors. And I got this recording of this tree, and when you record something, there's kind of a love affair that goes on. You start to fall in love with this object and the sound it's capable of making. And I came back a few days later. It was on the Saturday I came back, as a working Saturday, and something was strange about the site. I was walking around, what's going on here? I'm missing something on this site. I couldn't for the life of me figure it out, because I'm more of a sound than a visual person, I'll confess. And I was wandering around, and then I suddenly looked up and realised there was this vast blank space in the sky with this huge conifer had gone. I said, where's the tree, And then we had to take it down because of the wind. And then when I looked around, the ground was covered in wood chip and shavings, and we gave a hand sweeping it up. I think that's that sort of contribution is very appreciated down at the SKLR.
So it's you've almost become a part of the team and become a part of the SKLR, I suppose. And I certainly have felt that way anyway.
Well, indeed, one of the members, Alan, came up the other day, and he was saying it's about time you sort of joined. So I suggested to the SKLR that they set up an art department, and we'll be well in there.
We are at the moment talking to Jim, and of course we're talking to Jim as he's our sound artist for Arts Transmission, the first of 3 sound artists to be commissioned. Jim's been working with the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway, and we're at the point of airing the series of pieces of sound art from the railway, and Jim in the studio with Jim, one of 3 sound artists to be commissioned for Arts Transmission, which is the project funded by Ideas Test, Creative People and Places, Swale and Medway. Jim's in the studios. We've come to the end of the first part of the project, which was Jim working with the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway. So we're talking to him a little bit how he's been getting on, and also talking to him a bit about, of course, airing our first piece of sound art. And we're going to be airing a piece each week thereon over the next few weeks. Jim, have you achieved everything you wanted to?
In the project? Well, that's one way of putting it. I actually don't really see it as a case of me achieving stuff I want to do, really. I see it much more, my role is much more as a mediatory role, where I sort of enter the situation with the railway and with yourselves, and really find a way of bringing 2 practices together, which is the existing sort of practice of the railway and what they do, with a sort of more arts-based practice. So it's really like revoicing what's there. So I'm acting as an interpreter and things. So in that sense, I feel it's been very successful. But really, in the sort of in the human terms, in getting to know the station, the railway, getting to know the railway, and meeting all these fabulous, generous, warm-hearted people, and all these individuals, sort of having time to chat, and I hope I've tried to sort of reflect that in the sort of programme, that what sort of goes on down there, because it's this huge range of activities. So the answer essentially, Daniel, is I've been delighted. I've loved my time down there. And there's still a few visits to go, which is lovely to be returning down there, and I've been made very welcome, and I think that kind of says everything. That you go into a situation, and when it comes right down to it, you feel at home.
Oh yeah, it's certainly been a nice experience. I think it's been nice for me because it's achieved everything I'd hoped for when I initially talked it over with Laura and Louisa Francis Knight, the commissioning company. I've been able to come down with you, and we've worked together and worked with the railway, and the project has progressed, I think, and that's nice. As an artist myself, you always like to think that when you're doing work, you don't always fully know what the outcome's going to be, because by being there, the process happens and the work happens because you're there, and that's what it's all about. That's how I felt. So it's certainly been nice in that sense.
Yeah, it's a living process. Absolutely a living process to sort of go in and have that open mind, but you've just got a slightly different agenda. I mean, as the railway volunteers are there to run, essentially a service for the public and provide a really wonderful resource for Sittingbourne, and bring to life all that marvellous history and keep it going and keep these marvellous machines running. I think we've also gone down there with our own purpose, which is a separate purpose but a related purpose. We're sort of exploring another side to the SKLR. What can happen to it in an artistic sense? How can all these elements be brought to life in another way? And in that sense, I think it's been a great success, because the reaction we've had down there has just been absolutely wonderful. As I said, people have literally kind of bent over backwards. They've come and grabbed us when we're sort of in the middle of sort of taking a break. What are you doing sitting in the cafe? Get out there. They're doing this. There's that sound. You're going to miss it. So you go dashing off with the microphone and stuff like that. So I mean, there's been that real response, and that to me, that suggests the success of the project. I just hope that my humble sound pieces reflect that to some degree.
So I suppose, was it anything like you expected? Because I think, when you first come down and we interviewed you, you'd never been there before. Was actually what was down there and how it's been, was it anything like you expected?
Well, yes and no. I'd have to say probably in a percentage sense, it was 20% of what I expected to some degree. Having read up about Heritage Railway a bit, I've always loved the sound of steam trains, but I knew very little about Heritage Railway. So I did quite a lot of research before the project started. So there was like confirmatory things there when I got down to the project, as you'd expect, But what was quite amazing was the other 80%. I mean, let me give you an example. One thing, when I first went there to the actual site, there's so much stuff there, so much like pieces of rail and metal and stuff. I mean, it's the most remarkable collection. They've got all these sort of wagons and things, and sort of sound-wise, visually, it looks like a sort of railway scrapyard in some sense. It's very sort of rough and ready, and again, to me, that's sort of also reinforced by the actual journey. When we took our first rail journey on the railway, this was in December when they run these special Santa specials that time of year. It's a kind of kiddies thing where they come in and meet Santa and get to ride on the steam train. Very exciting for the families. And we went on the journey, and Daniel, you came on that journey, and you were explaining to me along the way, what was there. And, I came down, and I was expecting this kind of picturesque, here we are, like down in the Garden of England, down in Kent, and we're going to ride along through these leafy apple groves, and we're going to see all these lovely trees and plants, and it's all going to be pleasant. And there we are, and there's all these, like, concrete works, and then we sort of go past the sewage works, and then there's like the recycling plant, and there's all these forklift trucks and great big mashing machines and all this noise and hungry seagulls flapping around the place. And then suddenly you kind of burst away from all this wonderful industrial stuff, and you come to the open land of the Milton Country Park, and there's all these reeds, and it's very, very flat, very open, very dramatic, the sky. And then in the distance, you see these clouds of smoke wreathing through the air, which, of course, is the existing paper mill, which runs 24 hours. It's like the largest recycling plant. And they're nestled in the distance, these gates, and there's the SKLR. You go inside. So you've come through this completely unexpected landscape, which changes very rapidly from industry to country to industry, and that sort of set me up for the whole project. I think having this kind of experience that this isn't a kind of picture book sort of railway. It's not kind of like all sort of pretty flowers and everything like that, although there is that aspect to it. But it's a very gritty working place, and I think it's coming to know that purpose, that it's reflecting the history of Sittingbourne, and it's reinforced in every stage or in the site. But the thing I wanted to point out was that at first it kind of looks very chaotic, like I say, like it's like a rail junkyard and stuff. So it's quite, there's quite a harsh sort of side to it as well. All this rusting metal and things piled up, which interests me, which I find absolutely beautiful. I mean, I've got a great love of industrial landscapes, and I think they've got their place in the human imagination. But over time, and we have spent a lot of time down there, a lot of visits, it really transforms, and you go through this process, and the place starts to live in your dreams. I mean, one of the specific things for me is that one of the key things that I love is these pipes that are still lying by the side of the railroad, which will feature in the sound art you're going to hear. They feature very strongly, these pipes, because running all the way, most of the length of the railroad, probably like 4/5 of the railroad, are these two black pipes, one very large and one about half the size. They run all the way. They snake along like two black snakes following the railway. Sometimes they climb into the air when there's a turning, like an old roadway. They suddenly mount this structure, taking this sinuous turn into the sky and back down again. And they're absolutely visually beautiful. And for me as well, I'm a little bit of a classicist on the side, and they always kind of remind me of this story. There was, I'm sure everyone's heard about the Trojan horse and the fall of Troy, when the Greeks were besieging Troy. I mean, in fact, there was Brad Pitt in that blockbuster film a while ago. But one of the characters you probably don't hear about so much is a guy called Laocoon. and he was the guy who kind of blew the whistle. And when the Greeks turned up with his giant horse on the gates of Troy, Laocoon came rushing out, and he was the down-to-earth guy. He could have worked at the SKLR. He sort of kind of said, "Hang on, what's going on here with this horse? I don't like the look of this. You crazy, And he's very famous. This guy. He came up with the saying, and I'm paraphrasing it slightly here, but beware of Greeks bearing gifts. He said something like, I don't trust the Greeks, even when they're bearing these gifts, like this great horse. So everyone be careful. Of course, it's a mythological story. So on the side of the Trojans was the sea god Poseidon, and he sent these two snakes running out of the sea. And they jumped up on poor Laocoon and bit him to death. So he couldn't go on saying, look, it's a ruse. This horse is going to be our undoing. It's going to be the end of Troy. And so these two snakes sent by the sea god sort of bit this poor guy to death. So when I kind of look out, these two black snakes, these two steam pipes running the length of the railway, I was thinking this classical story came to mind. So, yeah, I'm probably stretching things a bit there, Daniel.
Well, we are going to be airing our first piece of sound arts. I was just hoping you could give a little introduction before we play that first part.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I had these initial ideas for coming in, and I thought it would be quite nice if I could do some sort of dramatic pieces. It's often a good way of condensing the sort of activities. I kind of chat to people and get to know what they do, and then I'm very much into writing scripts, so I like to go off, and really that's my kind of transformative thing, is taking everyone's experiences and the ideas and my experiences of the place and visitors, and turning that into a very sort of condensed piece of fiction, if you like, but something that really reflects people's actual experience and lives. But like I say, what I found on the railroad is that that idea would not encapsulate everything, would not contain all the sort of sounds and the drama of the place down there. It's a very, very lively site with hundreds of activities, these volunteers coming down, managing all sorts of things. And I still haven't figured out, after all this time, how on earth they decide who does what. You go in on a working day on a Wednesday, and people just get to work doing stuff. No one's standing there saying, right, Sheila, you go over there and do that, and Bert, it's time we did this. This doesn't seem to happen. They've got this telepathic thing going on down there. So next thing, these people are, someone's nailing that, someone's painting that, someone's washing that thing, this is being stripped down, holes are being dug in the ground, next thing there's 400 trees turn up on a truck, and the next day there's like 50 Boy Scouts come down and plant them all along the railway. I mean, it's this incredible sort of organised activity, and I suspect Bob and Liz have something to do with that, but there's a lot of initiative on the site. So I really wanted the sound piece to somehow reflect 360 degrees, if you like, the entirety of that sort of site. So it's the human experiences, it's the sort of sound experiences you go down and listen to, and that covers everything from the railroad, the tracks, people's working on the tracks, pouring ballast, then the sound of people gardening. There's all the work that goes down there, the conservation work. There's this incredible conservation work that goes down at the SKLR, looking after exotic beetles. They've got these ivy bees that have come in, these visitors from France, recent visitors. And then you go to the back of the site, walk through the squeaky gate. I'm going to play some squeaky gate in one of the episodes, because there's a favourite squeaky gate of mine down there, and you're suddenly on the creek. And Daniel, we actually tried to record some of the birds one day, didn't we? What did they do?
The minute you got the mic out, they stopped. They
scarpered. Yeah, this is when you're doing any sort of sound work, whether it's documentary work or sound art. And I love the human voice, and for me the human voice captures a lot of people's experience. Just their lives are contained in their voices, from the sound of a baby to the sound of somebody on their deathbed. There's a character in there, and there's a wealth of experiences you can't even begin to unravel. I mean, one person's life, all those moments in time put together, and but you can get some flavour from somebody talking about something they're really passionate about, such as the railway and what they do down there, whether it's gardening or maintenance or cooking or working in the shop, and getting all those sort of sounds together and finding a way to express that has really been my purpose with this project, bringing all those things together. And they're little 10-minute shows. We've got 5 shows. So what I've ended up with, Daniel, is I've tried to look for essences, if you like, the essential things down there. So what I've planned to do is 5 short themed shows. So the first one we're going to hear today is all about steam, and steam for me relates very much to the breath of life. If you stood up on a cold misty morning and you stood outside and you breathe out, there's that lovely sight of your air condensing, your breath condensing in the air, and this kind of steam curling around you. And or standing at a bus stop, at 6 a.m, it's dark and it's frosty and it's cold. Everyone's standing at the bus stop, and all this breath is pouring out into steam in people's mouths. And you come down here, and one of the first things that absolutely sort of just made me sort of tremble with its very beauty was the sight of a train, one of the steam trains, running back to Sittingbourne. I was standing at the platform on Kemsley watching it just retreat. I was getting a recording, and I completely forgot I was recording because the visual thing was so strong. I mean, it was a cold sort of damp day. The mist comes in off the creek round here. It gets, you get all this kind of foggy, misty stuff. And here was this train just kind of disappearing up the track into the sort of rainy mist. And, it was just an absolutely breathtaking sight. And trying to capture that in sound has really sort of occupied me. And I think the metaphor of steam is a really powerful one for life itself. So I wanted to start off with steam in the first of these episodes.
And here is that first part, entitled Steam.
I was the first female fireman down here.
No, basically, I picked shovels. Which is not like not most things.
How did all these sounds come to be here? These particular voices, diesel and steam. Creaking tracks. Ballast falling like impatient rain. The clatter of cups in the cafe. The wailing screech of power tools. And in the garden by the museum, hawthorn branches gently shuddering in the wind. What brought them together, here, in this time and this place?
Press your ear to the rail. Episode 1. Steam.
Steam has always been part of us, from the first icy breath on a winter's morning to the sight of a loco wreathed in curling steam. However, not just the railway has run on steam. The paper mill at Sittingbourne was steam-powered from an early date. With the building of a second mill at Kemsley, it was decided to concentrate steam production in one place. This resulted in the construction of a steam pipeline alongside the railway, feeding live steam to the machinery at both mills. The smaller of the two carry the live steam, and the larger the exhaust steam and condensed water. The hissing of these pipes was a feature of the railway for many a year. They now lie silent.
Paging driver 671. Paging driver 671. Would you kindly remove your steam from the tannoys before they
Yeah, really, it felt like Dickensian, with the giant red wall looming over you and the steam coming out of the pipes, the hissing, and yeah, it felt really Victorian, yeah. I didn't mind it in the daylight, but of course the mill walls were still there when I started commuting up to London to work. So on the winter evenings, walking from the station back up into Milton, And we didn't have the orange lights in those days. All the lights in Sittingbourne were blue lights, and it cast such an eerie, well, like something from a film, really. I felt anxious at times doing that walk back home, yeah.
Daniel and Jim are up the SKLR line, pursuing an interesting project. They're going to inject some fresh steam sounds into the old pipe network. They're hoping in some small way to bring the pipes back to life.
Right, we've climbed up onto the Sittingbourne viaduct that the train travels along, and we're next to this. What would you describe it as, Daniel?
Well, it's a metal pipe, I suppose, double the size of a sewer pipe, but it's really thick metal, and I assume it was to do with the steam or carrying water back to the Kemsley paper mill running along the side of the viaduct, so it's just hanging off the side.
It's right next to these black pipes that did in fact carry the steam. Unfortunately, there's no way of getting into these old pipes, so we're going to have to settle for second best and use this. Is it an iron pipe?
Yeah, I'd assume so, yeah. It's quite rusty.
Should we pace out and see how many paces long it is, Daniel?
Yes, yeah.
8, 10, 11, 15, 16. How many paces do you make that?
About 16, wasn't it?
16 paces long?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like a foot diameter, I'd guess. So it's quite a wide-looking pipe. What are we here to do today?
We're going to try and put a speaker in one end and play some steam sounds, and you're going to put your microphone in the other end, and hopefully that sound will travel down the pipe and give us a sort of a distorted effect, or even perhaps an effect of how the original steam pipes might have sounded, hopefully.
Do you know what I feel a bit like?
What?
I feel a bit like Baron Frankenstein.
Right.
Do you know why?
Why?
Because I'm bringing these old pipes back to life. Let's get to it. Okay, hit it! That was the end.
Is that the Art Transmission project?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Look, about this paper thing, I'm afraid you got it all wrong. It's not the paper, for goodness sake, it's the fire.
Fire!
Your domestic fire is probably only a ruddy glow, whereas the fire here will be blinding white hot when you've really got it going. So you're working the fire a lot harder, and you're obviously throwing a lot more coal on. But there's a great skill to it, because you have to ensure that you've got steam when you want it. The fire takes time to get going. You throw several shovelfuls of coal on the fire, and nothing happens for 10 minutes. So you've got to do it 10 minutes before you want things to happen. On the line here, you've got to look and think on the level on the way out, I don't really need an awful lot of fire. But later on, we're going uphill, and I should need a bit more fire there.
Me and Daniel's here at the coal shed. Daniel's agreed to do some shoveling, so let's see how we go. How was it?
Okay, yeah.
Could you see yourself earning a living shoveling?
I think my arms and back would be in problems if I did it too long.
Same for everyone. Joel, I see you're watering the hot ashes. Are you expecting it to grow?
Well, you never know. No, it's just to make sure it's all extinguished really before you leave it. That's the only reason. I'm going to put it back in the shed now. So
You're going to move it?
Yeah, going to move it, yeah.
You've still got enough power in there to move it?
Yeah, so yes, it's still got quite a bit of steam, so yeah.
Where does it store all the steam then? In the boiler? It's still...
Yeah, it just stays in there. So, yeah.
Fantastic. This I've got to hear.
Yeah.
All aboard, all aboard. Hurry up, you at the back. We're leaving, no, not on a jet plane. The signal's changing. We're off.
And that was our first piece of sound art from our first sound artist of three, Jim, and of course the series of pieces are entitled Press Your Ear to the Rail, and that first episode had its own title, Steam. And we are continuing to talk to Jim, our sound artist, who's been working with the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Railway as part of our project Art Transmission. And just before the news, we heard our first piece of sound art from Jim, entitled Steam. And Jim, I was hoping perhaps we could sort of go over, or you could go over what was involved in making that piece and editing that.
Yeah, well, it's quite an involved process, as you can probably hear. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. But the first stage really was coming down to the SKLR. And at Christmas time, as I mentioned before, they do the Santa specials, and I got quite a shock because obviously when you sort of come down to do a sound art project on a steam railway site, for me that was really, really exciting, coming down and recording these old locomotives, having that access, presumed access to these things. And of course the first thing I discovered on the first trip was that they don't run any steam at all in January, February, and a little bit in March as they get ready for the season, because I should just say the season's now up and running, and they're back in full bloom at the SKLR. So anyone thinking of visiting, like I say, I can only really urge you to pop down if you live in the locality, or you can get the HS1 anyway up the line from London. It's like an hour's very pleasurable ride. It's a really easy ride up there. You can come in from Victoria if you're sort of out that way. And their season's now begun. And Easter, they're running Easter sort of specials. We kicked off the other day, Daniel, there, didn't we?
Yeah, it was really nice. Actually, I think what I've enjoyed is being a part of... We sort of see the end of the season. We were with them all through their sort of maintenance and work period, and then we see them getting the railway ready, and then it's starting up. And it was quite nice in some ways, because we got used to meeting them as on their sort of work days. They were all dressed up, in their overalls and working. And when we went there and they were open, there was sort of a change. They'd all dressed up in their sort of uniforms and their SKLR ties and shirts, and it was like it was a real special thing for them, and they'd put all this effort in for the first opening day. And I think it's probably something that you perhaps don't notice so much if you're going there as a passenger, because that's how it would be. But because we'd seen behind the scenes, it was this special moment for them as well, the reopening, I think.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, it's a very professional organisation. One of the things I think we've both discovered since working down there, for instance, there's a very I forget the gentleman's name, but there's a very quite an elderly member who comes down, who if he doesn't still, certainly at one point, this chap, I don't know if you can remember his name, Daniel, but he used to drive Pendolino trains, and he held the sort of speed record for driving a Pendolino train. He also was old enough to have experience of driving steam trains, and he's a real sort of die-hard, railroad man, train driver. And he comes down and, wandered into the office, to grab a mic stand that I had there, and he was in the middle of he had one of the drivers in, David, he's in the middle of doing this really rigorous rule book test. So they really adhere to railway rules down. It's a very professional organisation, and obviously that's one of the things you become conscious of. They're carrying members of the public, and they really take their responsibilities of maintaining the track and the engines and running to timetable. What can I say? This is no joke. This is a serious business and stuff. And yet within that, which I hope I'm trying to sort of reflect in the pieces I'm creating, there's an adventurousness, there's a spirit of real fun, there's a lot of dry kind of humour, and there's a lot of the site just rings with laughter the whole time. I mean, everyone down there, Liz and Lynn and everyone in the gardening team, everyone on the permanent way, and Bob. I mean, there's a great sense of fun down there the whole time, and they drag you into their world, and sometimes it's very dry, and sometimes it's very slapstick and stuff. But it's a fun experience, and I think that underpins the whole thing. This sense of play, this sense of enjoyment, and one of the aspects about running a railroad like that again I really wanted to somehow feed into the piece is there's a kind of fantasy element somehow, even though it's all very serious, running a railway, and their commitment is to the public and providing a really good experience. There's also there's a romantic side, if you like, to running these old steam trains, as I'm sure you're aware of, Daniel. These lovely old engines, and you can't help but look at these things and be absorbed by the actual sort of mechanical beauty of these huge beasts. I mean, again, the thing with steam is it's such a living sort of force. When you hear that engine sort of forcing its way up the gradient up onto the Sittingbourne viaduct, it's quite a climb. And one of the engines we were riding on is from 1905. I mean, that is that's an old piece of kit by anyone's. But if you can imagine having a car that old, you'd probably you'd have to do some amazing work to get it running. But these things are built I'm not going to use the classic expression, but they're built to last, and all that kind of solidity and engineering from another age, the exactitude of these things, getting all these pistons and rods and valves to fit. Some amazing work, and it's a living tradition. They've sort of continued that. So I've tried to sort of reflect that in the work for the piece, and putting things together. But there's so many different aspects. So I'll just give you some idea of some of the flavours on things. Now I've really tried to, in making these pieces, have a sort of fidelity to stick to the sort of sounds I'd recorded there. Now obviously there's a few sounds that don't belong in there in the piece. I threw in a couple of explosions. I don't know how many explosions are done at the SKLR, hopefully not too many. So just for dramatic effect, I used a few sounds like, some telephone sounds and things like that. And they're like sort of, standard kind of samples you would find on the internet if you're doing sound design work or something. I've got a very large library of that stuff. That's another story. But I really wanted to sculpt everything, to create everything out of SKLR sounds. I mean, anything I could record. I mean, you've seen me at work down there, Daniel, on my microphone. I've been a bit like a recording lunatic, I would say.
Yes, yeah, definitely. It's been a good experience, and I think it is again. It's been being there. The sounds have been there, and by being there, you've been able to capture them, and you could certainly hear them in that piece. That's for sure.
Yeah, and there's different processes there. I mean, I've used a lot of the sounds as they are, quite sort of raw, but some of the sort of like the diesel whistles you hear, and at finishing the piece you hear one of the loco whistles on leader sort of blowing, and I've added some processing to that, a thing called reverberation, which it really creates that sound. If you were to stand at night in a sort of field and there was a railway in the distance, and that haunting beautiful sound you get when the whistle blows and it carries over the field. So it's a way of electronically really creating that kind of haunting, lasting sort of sound. It really adds a sort of, it stretches the sound out, if you like a sort of ghostly trail. So there's some processing like that. Also there's some kind of I suppose you'd call it quasi sort of slightly musical sounds in there, and in fact I used a piece of software that I love. It's called Melodyne DNA. And I'm probably going a bit specialist here, Daniel, talking about Melodyne, but it's a standard sort of sound design. If you do sound design work, it's a really useful piece of software to have. What it does in essence, one of its uses, a sort of standard uses, just say you're a guitarist, you play a guitar, 6 strings, you're very enthusiastic, you're going to record your song, so you play these chords, and then you listen back and you suddenly realize, oh dear, one of the strings was very out of tune, so you want to kind of fix it. And you sort of think, but I've made a recording, it's all together as one thing. I can't possibly fix that. Well, Melodyne is this piece of software. What it does is it analyses whatever you put into it and breaks it down into its constituent parts, into single, discrete, singular elements. So it could literally take the guitar chord into sort of 6 strings, and you could just tune one string and then put it back together, and you'd have a perfectly tuned part. So it's a bit like cheating, but I don't really use it in that way. I'm not in the business of correcting musical or tuning performances. I use it creatively. So I was feeding in steam engines, and it was taking all the different sounds of the steam and the mechanics and the clacking of the rails and turning them into separate elements. And then I was doing such things as a sort of transposition, where you stretch a sound out. It's like taking a piece of chewing gum in your hands and stretching it as far as you can go. And this software allows you to do that with an individual sound. So some of those more sort of ghostly sounds, as in the section of the piece where one of the volunteers, Lynn, was describing her memories when she uses the word Dickensian to describe the hissing of the pipes, if you remember that bit in the piece. Underneath it were some of these stretched loco sounds. So even in that case, something that sounds, vaguely like slightly eerie sort of music is actually constructed out of sounds that I've recorded down there. But obviously I've relied very heavily on this piece, on the sound of steam. It links the whole thing together from beginning to end. And that's all kind of sounds that have come from the locomotive. And like I say, I had great access. I've been all over these locos. I've been in the cabs. I've been underneath. I've almost had my arms scalded by sudden blasts of sort of steam. And I've gotten very close to it. And I've got to say, probably if you turned up for work, Daniel, you said my head is full of steam, most people would send you home again. But in this case, I've turned up tonight, and I can only say my head is full of steam.
And Jim, before you go, I was just hoping perhaps if you could go over some of the sound pieces of art we're going to be airing over the next few weeks.
Yeah, so I certainly will, Danny. Could I just do one more thing? I just wanted to say one more thing about the piece, and it's just to just as an interest thing. I wanted to kind of work in one sort of historical reference to famous sound art in the piece. So there's a piece of audio which belongs to this family of music called musique concrète. It's a French term that was really originally created back in the 40s, in the 1940s, and the main driver behind it was a guy called Pierre Schaeffer, and he did a very famous piece. And I've brought in tonight into the studio with me in my bag a special French speaker. And what I'd just like to do is just mention there's this Pierre Schaeffer. It's spelled Schaeffer, Pierre Schaeffer, and you can listen to it on YouTube, this piece, and you need to look for the following piece. So French speaker, can you come over to the microphone, please? Because my French is just really, non-existent. Could you just say what the piece is called? Getting close.
Étude de chemin de fer.
And one more time, please.
Étude de chemin de fer.
What does that mean?
Study of a railway.
Wow, wasn't that good? Okay. So, Daniel, I'd just like to point people to that piece because it was made with turntables, like record decks, and this guy, Pierre Schaeffer, manipulated the sounds, doing like transpositions of the pitch and the speed to create this very beautiful piece built out of railroad sounds collectively, so like whistles, locomotive engines, tracks sort of rattling, and certainly in there I inserted a little piece in the steam episode there to sort of reflect and to show it's a very rich, sound art has a very rich history as much as the railroad has, and these railway sounds have always influenced people's imagination, whether it's the books of Emile Zola or people's sound art pieces. There's a very sort of rich background to this. So as for the, I'll move on now. Sorry. As for the pieces coming up, there's 4 more episodes, which very kindly Daniel is going to be airing on the community show here on BRFM, and I'm certainly looking forward to that. And they're all works in progress, as you'd expect. I'm very much the sound artist who works right up against the deadline, and in fact I think I had less than 2 hours sleep last night to get the programme ready, so that's probably why I'm speaking such nonsense tonight, so forgive me there. But here are the episodes coming up. So this is a bit of a taster. So the next one is going to be called Track, and that's all about being out on the rails and the sounds associated with the rails and the transportation running over the rails, and wagons and coaches and all those sort of bits and pieces, the bits you ride in when you go on a railway journey, and also some of the sounds that you get out on the track. So one of the things I did, yes, I'm thinking here, with Daniel, we went out, and hopefully you can talk a bit about this, Daniel, when you air the next piece, if you've got a minute. But one of the time-honoured things in the railway is testing the sleepers that support the rails, and they do a thing called sleeper tapping. They go out and they tap the sleepers, and they have a very special tool for this. Do you remember what this special tool was, Dan? It gave me such a shock. I was expecting some sort of specialised rod with some sort of gauges on it and some sort of rubber ending so you didn't damage these wooden sleepers. I thought, they're going to bring out some amazing tool and let us use it. And Bob, who's who's the MD down there and sort of runs the CAF and stuff, went into the shed and came back. I almost fell over. What did he bring out, Daniel?
A normal hammer.
Well, not just a normal hammer, it was a great big monster club hammer. And what was his advice?
Don't worry, you can sort of tap away, I think, wasn't it? Something like that.
He said, give it a walloping great whack, was what he said. I just could have fallen over. I thought, you can't go around whacking the sleepers with this great big hammer. And so in the next episode, Track, we're going to be hearing some of our experiments out on the railway, Daniel. We did a fair bit of tapping out there.
Yeah, it was quite interesting actually. And you could hear the difference between the new sleepers and the older sleepers. There was a difference.
Yeah. I was a bit nervous when you were tapping some of the older ones, I must say. They were going to fall to pieces. Vandals on the track. Quick, call the transport police. So after Track, I've got rather a special little show called The Event, and this is like this is a kind of bit of a fantasy story for the SKLR, and it's about the day the Scandinavians came and asked the SKLR to do a special job. They hired, because the railway's available for hire if you want to speak to the management there. If you're doing some sort of special event. I mean, a marvellous place to do an event. People do hire it sometimes, and various groups. They've had theatre groups down there and sort of art outing days and stuff. So it's very flexible and a great thing to do, to come down and hire it. And in this case, in this particular episode, we're going to hear what happens when the Scandinavians came down and hired the SKLR to transport a piece of conceptual art on the railway. So probably doesn't happen that often. Although I did hear that Damien Hirst has bought a very big house next to one of the other heritage railways, somewhere. Is it up in Yorkshire or somewhere, Daniel, or in the Midlands?
I don't know. I don't think I've heard that one actually, so I don't know.
Yeah, he's got a house. He's really very close. This railway, I think, runs past his house. This one of these kind of heritage railways. So quite so amazing, and one of the sort of classic trains. So I'll say no more about that. You can look that up. See, where does Damien Hirst live? If you're interested. Don't go around knocking on his door asking for anything with butterflies. And episode after the event, we've got one called Metal. So do you think metal's important down at the railway, Daniel?
Well, yeah, definitely. I would have thought.
In what way would you say it's important?
Well, it makes everything, doesn't it? From the tracks to the engines to the carriages. It certainly plays a big role. I think it does. Although I did read in my research that some of the earliest rails were made of wood. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. So on some of the, this is going way back. The dawn of the industrial railway age. Tracks made of wood. I mean, how long do you think a wooden track would last, Daniel? Not very long, I wouldn't have thought, unless they were sort of very small engines and carriages.
What, how small? Like sort of 3 inches high? Anyway, so metal. Yeah, so metal, very important, yes. And the last, sorry, I must stop laughing. The last episode, that we're going to finish off our series with an episode called Wildlife. So it's slightly a double-edged meaning to the word wildlife when you come to the SKLR, because it also, as well as referring to all the wonderful animals and creatures that take habitation around there. And of course there's the estuary, Daniel, isn't there? And we were talking about trying to record the birds earlier.
Yeah, which you managed to eventually do. It was sort of a really sort of peaceful, calm day very recently, and
Dead right.
We captured it.
Well, Daniel, I must say that was all thanks to you, because I had my head in the air as usual, and you came along and grabbed me, and and said, "Oh, have you been out on the creek?" I said, "No," and of course, this is the big difference. It's tidal, the creek, so the waters rise and recede, and at this point they'd risen, and in with the tides had come lots of the sort of birds, and I guess because now we're well into spring, we're into April, so this was the end of March. Suddenly these birds went out there, and I sort of thought, oh, they're all going to fly away. And what happens is there's a lot of ambient sound around the creek. There's distant roads, and even though I've got quite sensitive microphones, and I can turn up the recording so I can pick up very distant sounds, the birds seem to fly so far away that they more or less, even though they're making these beautiful noises, and again, one of the things I spoke about in our very first interview is the difference between ears and microphones don't have a sort of brain, so to speak, because when we listen with our ears, everything we hear, we can then selectively sort of mix in our mind. So if you want to hear the conversation of a friend standing next to you in a noisy environment, if you're by a noisy road, it's quite easy using our brain's processing power to pick out what your friend is saying. But of course, with a microphone, it's not so easy. So the microphone can't differentiate between these two sounds. So I wasn't really getting these bird sounds, and then in comes the tide, and I'd say, thanks to Daniel, I went out there, and the birds, they didn't run off. They stayed there. So I'm hoping that some of those recordings will feature in that last sort of episode, Wildlife.